Good morning. I want to start by thanking Bishop Gronberg for inviting me to spend this time with you today as you gather for your assembly. Talk to you a little bit about grief and loss in congregational systems and about the work that I've done around that. I want to start by saying a little bit about myself and a little bit about why I wrote this book, Embracing God's Future Without Forgetting the Past. Before I became bishop, I was a campus pastor for almost 20 years. In about 15 of that, I was also adjunct faculty at two universities, the University of South Dakota and then at the University of Oklahoma. And while I was teaching, I focused on teaching courses in death and dying, grief and loss. And so when I come to these subjects and talk about these things, I don't come as a grief therapist or a grief counselor, but I come at this, first of all, as a grief educator, and have taught lots of students over the years about grief and about loss, about death and dying. But primarily, I come at these subjects as a pastor and have walked with, as a pastor, providing pastoral care to grieving people over my whole ministry. I wrote this book after I started noticing that the congregation I was working with as I was beginning my ministry as a bishop were doing things and saying things and acting in ways that reminded me an awful lot about some of the people that I walk with during their grief. People who were particularly stuck in their grief, who just couldn't continue to work on their grief processes. And so I started to do some investigating, some reading, some reflecting, some actually working with congregations, and discovered that our congregations, because of the decline they've experienced, because of the loss they've experienced, were in fact grieving, and often we're very much stuck in that grief. And so I started to ask myself, how can we help congregations who are dealing with all kinds of different losses move through their grief and on into some new future? And that's where this book came from. So during our 4 sessions today, I'm going to spend just a little time introducing you to some of the ideas that emerged from my work, my research, the conversations, and from the congregations that have taught me to get you starting to think about perhaps the grief that's happening in your own congregations. My basic premise is this: loss always results in grief. Whether it's a small loss, like the loss of a wallet, although I suppose if you have a lot of money in it, it wouldn't be a small loss, or a huge loss, a significant loss, like the death of someone we love. Loss always results in grief. Whether it's a small loss or a large loss, there's always some grief there. And change always results in loss. And our congregations, certainly during the last year or so, because of the pandemic, have experienced all kinds of change. We've had to let go of all sorts of different things. And so there's grief in that. But even before the pandemic hit over a year ago, our congregations were dealing with changes in the makeup of their congregations as we've dealt with the symptoms of decline: empty pews, older membership, lack of children and adults, you know the litany. So the question is, how do we understand the grief we're experiencing as congregations, and how do we begin to work through that? David Rosen, in his study, American Congregations 2015, Thriving and Surviving, looked at the whole question of change and loss and how that was impacting congregations. And in his report, he quotes cultural sociologist Ann Swidler, who said this: "Few would disagree that we live in a period of profound social and cultural change." He says cultural sociologist Ann Swidler refers to such times as unsettled. I think we know what that means. By this, she means that traditional ways of doing things typically no longer work, and new strategies for action must be developed without any assurance that they will work. He wrote that in 2015, or she said that in 2015. And certainly the last year has been a year of being unsettled, of trying all sorts of new things without having any idea if they will work. And all of that change has generated and cultivated loss and grief among us. So I want to introduce you during this session to some new ways of thinking about grief and loss. Well, actually, they're not really new. Reality is these ideas have been around probably for 20 years or more. But I think for a lot of us, the last thing we kind of learned about grief was the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Her work is very much in the center of the public's understanding of what grief and loss is all about. But the reality is that Kubler-Ross, as important as her work was done in the 1960s. Her book on death and dying came out in 1968. And a lot of work has been done on grief and how grief works in our lives since then. She was a pioneer in the field. She identified 5 very significant and fairly common experiences people have when they're grieving. But we no longer really talk about stages. To talk about grief in terms of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work from 1968 is kind of like talking about technology in the church from the perspective of the touchtone phone, which was invented just about the same time. And so I want to introduce you to some of the things that we've learned since Kubler-Ross did her work. And one of those things is that grief, now we understand, is focused on tasks, not stages. And I'll say a bit more about that in just a second. The other thing that we've learned is that the purpose of grief is not to sever emotional bonds. Freud said that back in the early 20th century. The idea was to sever our emotional bonds, to set those relationships aside so we could move on. Instead, what we understand now is the purpose of grief and the grief process is to redefine our relationship with the deceased, with whatever we have lost, with the past as congregations. It's not to forget the past. It's not to forget that which we've lost. It's not to forget our loved ones, as if we ever could. But to take those memories and find a place in our hearts and in our lives so that we can move on. So we can appreciate the past without it trapping us in the present. Grief, we have discovered, is not like this. It's not a straight arrow. It's not like you do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and then it's all done. Anybody who grieves or who has grieved knows that that is not the case. That's not how it works. Grief is actually more like this. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's good days and bad days. It's feeling like you're making progress and then feeling like you're right back at the beginning. It twists and it turns, and it's chaotic, not linear. I like to follow a task-based model that was developed by psychologist William Worden. He's updated it several times, but the most recent edition is from 2009, so that in fact is still fairly dated. But I find this task-based model of grief very helpful. There are other task-based models, very good ones, some of them much more complicated than Worden's. But I like Worden's model because it's easy to grasp, particularly for somebody who's deep in their grief. And it also is very clear about how it is and what it is we need to be working on as we grieve. I'm going to give you a quick overview, and then in the rest of the sessions with you today, I'm going to look at each of these tasks in turn. Now, I list the tasks linearly, but they don't really happen that way. They're listed in a way that the ones that we experience first, most often, are listed first, but the reality is that they can come back again and again in the process of grief. And so the first task is simply accepting the reality of the loss. An example of how these tasks work is an experience I had after my father died. My father has been gone over 25 years, and it was about 10 years after he died that I was in a shopping mall in Sioux City, Iowa at Christmas time. The mall was crowded, no social distancing or mask wearing, packed with people doing their Christmas shopping. And my father was a man who was 6 feet tall, had beautiful white hair. I'm 5'5", so my dad was tall compared to me. Anyway, so I'm walking through the mall, and all of a sudden up in front of me, I see a tall man with beautiful white hair. And I thought to myself in that moment, what's my dad doing in the mall? And I actually took 2 steps towards this man, and I had to do task 1 all over again. I had to remind myself, my dad's been gone for 10 years. That is not my father. He's gone. And I had a little moment of having to revisit this, needing to accept the reality that my father was no longer with me. That's the way these tasks work. Second task is processing the pain of the grief, working through not only the emotional pain, but a lot of the other kinds of pain and sorrow that we experience when we're grieving. The third task is adapting to the world without the deceased. adapting to the changed world in which we find ourselves after a loss. And I think a lot of congregations are trying to figure out how to adapt, even in the midst of their grief and sorrow. This last year has been a year full of adaptation and adjusting, and we need to talk about that a little later in the day. And finally, task 4 is finding an enduring connection with the deceased, not severing bonds, but finding an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. It's finding a new place in our hearts and in our lives for that which we've lost, so that in fact we may step into the future that God is preparing for us. In the next session, we'll get started taking a look at these tasks. Again, it's great to be with you on this day.